I already know that some people are going to be blessed by this webinar because the enemy did everything possible to prevent me from being here. Right? Even after the power went out and I was racing over to the church here, I had to go around people digging holes in the street and heavy traffic. I mean, everything. So I know, I already know that some people are going to be blessed by what we're doing here today. So
Chris said that he could feel it was going to be a good one too, and that he's also very excited. So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome again to everyone who's just joining us. We're super excited today to be here with John Mays and Chris Hall for this biology webinar. And just throughout the presentation, I'm sure you're going to have some questions. So please just drop those in the Q&A box at any time, rather than the chat box. We'll kind of leave that more for writing purposes. And I'll turn it over to both of you guys. Would you please introduce yourselves and kick us off?
Certainly.
Chris, you were here
John,
first.
I'm going to leave this one to you.
One another.
John,
I'm John Mays, and I am the writer of the Novare Science curriculum, most of it anyway, and then with some help for the biology books. And now we're part of Classical Academic Press. And speaking of the biology books, that's where the idea came for today's webinar. After saturating in writing biology books for the last about 7 years, and we've produced 3 of them now, but I've just been doing nothing but reading these texts over and over. You know, to produce a text, you have to read it about 15 times. And the more, every time I go through it, I just notice another way that the stuff in the text is just so strongly pointing to a loving creator, designer. And I just felt like this was a message we need to work harder to convey to students, because they live in a time where it's really easy to feel like you're being beaten up all the time. You know, all science points to atheism, all climate change and pollution, everything points to God's not paying attention. Every time they turn around, they're hearing something in the news that could undermine their faith. So I think it's important for us to get a message out that is to the contrary. Who are you, Chris?
Amen. I would say amen to that. And the only thing I'd add is a brief introduction. I'm Chris Hall. I have been a science teacher now for 30 years. This is year 30 I'm going into right now. Only some of that time biology. Most of my background is physics, strongly physics, and a good chunk of chemistry as well, and earth science. Biology was one of those sciences I always loved. It was one of those ones I studied, but I never became a full-fledged, essentially bio teacher on this. However, the one thing that I probably have more to contribute perhaps on this end of the conversation today is the garden, is the farm, is the homestead, is the woodworking, is all the pieces where our biology, instead of drilling into the micro, the kind of the reductionist or isolationist of what could be a very materialist lab, to me is very alive and large. When I step out the door into the garden, all those little micro pieces of the lab are staring back at me from tomato plants. They're staring back at me from the mycorrhizomes in my soil. And of course, too, biology on a farm is animals. We're raising animals for food and for work, for time, and it's one of those places where I think, as John and I talked before this, and John, you sent me a wonderful set of notes on this. We're drinking from the same fonts. We've read many of the same authors. You more well-read, I think, than I am on this one for certain. But perhaps one of the beauties that we have, being the two of us on the screen today, is that we have both the lab and the garden. We have this combination of things, and the way that we see those and the way that we see God's providence play out through biology and a variety of vectors that may give a little color and flavor to our conversation today. So I'm just thrilled to be here with you today, John, you and everyone who is on this call today. So thank you for being here.
Well, speaking of that set of notes, after I sent it to you, I was thinking, you can kind of divide these topics into 2 big categories. One category is things we can observe in nature. Anybody can observe them. And that's what you're talking about, Chris, with the garden and just having your hands out in the creation. And other topics on this list are things that we know because of scientific research. And these are things that not everybody knows, not unless you've, had some good biology classes. So why don't we start with just a few observations from nature? Maybe, Chris, you and I can kind of just share some of our favorites. One of my favorites is that every organism in the universe, it acts with purpose, with intentionality. And every organism intends to stay alive and tries to do that. Every organism intends to mate, intends to eat, intends to be in an environment it can tolerate, and will try to move to one if it needs to. It's impossible to describe the way every organism, from bacteria all the way up to whales, everything in between, it's impossible to talk about their behavior without talking about intentionality or purpose. An atheist philosopher at Harvard, Thomas Nagel, a few years ago, wrote a book called Mind and Cosmos. Is that right? He said, the materialist neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. He's an atheist saying that. But one of the things he has in mind is that there's no way to explain intentionality and purpose apart from some kind of mind behind the creation. He doesn't want to admit that that's the Christian God. He says he doesn't want to be told about religion. He rejects that. But nevertheless, he doesn't have anywhere else to turn. All he can say is there's something else out there and we don't know what it is. What's your favorite one?
Well, I was going to say that last one reminds me a lot of Anthony Flew, right? He spent a whole lifetime as an atheist, and then all of a sudden at the end he says, I throw my hands up at this, right? There's the order staring back at me. And I think that's the one, perhaps of two things I could pitch out right here at the beginning that are just savory to my mind and my imagination. And I mean that both this mind, the mind of the body, but also a spiritual mind, as I'm thinking about how this is reflected in the world. The first is that there is that order. Of all the possibilities that order could be here, I mean, what is it? It's like 1 times 10 to the 10 to the 120th power that things have tuned themselves out to be very much like they are right now. And we can see the balances of the laws, the balances that allow our chemistry, the biochemical processes that make a tomato happen or a fish sing. And we can see the order there. And yet there's a law of science that essentially says entropy is the way. The longer we go, without going into details, right, in the laws of thermodynamics, the second law implies this, that unless there's an ordering, unless you add energy back to a system, it will tend to chaos. And yet here we are swimming in a world of orderly systems. How did that happen? And it doesn't happen necessarily by chance. I think that's one huge one, and maybe a formative block, a cornerstone upon which so many other good observations of this might bear fruit. But I also want to talk perhaps today a little bit about this notion of consciousness. That's one of those other things that philosophers, theologians, and others, they can't, philosophers and just looking at scientists alone can't get to the root of consciousness. How are we even not only here, but how are we even aware that we're here? And that leads into other things you mentioned on your notes, John, like animals playing, right, amongst others. And these are some beautiful pieces to consider. So I think perhaps for me, the big bucket on this one, the one that holds all of this together for me, is the fact that there is such an incredibly impossible order to all of this unless we see the hand of a creator and the mind of a creator behind it. That speaks to me almost mathematically in its elegance.
Yeah, animal behavior is one of my favorite things to catalog, because we like to talk as if humans are the only ones that do things just for the fun of it, and that we do it because we're rational and the animals are not. Nothing could be more misconstrued than that. I mean, all right, here are things I've seen myself. All right, I've seen calves skipping like crazy people just because they were released into a field that was recently plowed and the earth is freshly turned over. And not just calves, but mama cows, big ones, will frolic like like you can't believe. I was rewatching some YouTube videos yesterday. If you guys want to look them up later, one's called Crow Skiing Down a Roof. Here's a crow picking up a little plastic lid of some kind, carrying up to the top of a snow-covered roof, getting on it and riding it down, and then picking it up again and going up and doing it repeatedly for fun. I mean, clearly he's playing in the snow, skiing. You've probably all seen the videos of various cockatiels and stuff dancing to music. If you haven't, there's one called Birds Dancing to Music that's a compilation of about 10 different ones. And they're hysterical. I never go to the beach without sitting and just gazing straight up at the pelicans flying in formation without flapping their wings, because they're riding the thermal current, sea breeze and the thermal currents coming off the sand, and they're doing this for the sheer pleasure of it. Now, they're not looking for food. That's clear. When one of them's hungry, he leaves the formation, flies out of the ocean, falls in, gets a fish, later comes back and joins his buddies in the formation. They just go up and down the beach. Vultures do the same thing, not in formation. They just go in circles, riding the thermals straight up into the sky, hundreds of feet, clearly just flying for pleasure. Lots of animals do things for pleasure besides cats and dogs that we're familiar with. Lots of animals do this. And this is part of intentionality. And there's some kind of subhuman rationality that they possess to go with it. But it's not just us acting with intentionality. It's across the board. Even plants, will grow toward the window where the light is, right? They'll intentionally bend to where the light is. Intentionality is everywhere we look. Let's talk about some of the findings from research that are mind-blowing. There's a lot of material out there on this, and I try to cite a lot of it in my blog posts now and then, so to help people get these references and things. But just some authors that write a lot about this. One is Michael Denton, has written a stack of books, like The Miracle of Man and The Miracle of Light. Lawrence Henderson, his is probably the oldest treatment. Early 20th century, he wrote a book called The Fitness of the Environment, talking about all the properties of water and light and everything else that makes the environment fit for organisms large and small. And there's a lot there, One of the ones that I like, I think I'll just start here with, is the research that's been done in the last 60 years on the origin of life. The scientists are really trying hard to figure out how to explain the origin of life without a life giver. And guess what? Every teenager needs to know that this effort has been going on for about maybe pushing 70 years, early 50s. And a real hard effort with many major theories put forward and tried out. All have completely collapsed. All of them. Not one of them has even a prayer of success right now. I was talking with an atheist friend lately, and he said, oh, some of these computer modeled worlds are starting to show promise. And all you have to do is say, yeah, they only work because a programmer loaded code in here and set a bunch of rules from his mind to logically describe the environment that this computer object is going to dwell in. And then the computer object can do something that looks like maybe it's alive or something. Well, guess what? That sounds a lot like, the design of our world with its laws of nature and its properties and everything, all given to it by the creator. And life comes forth. He calls it forth. So however he called it forth, I have no idea. But I know he called it forth. and it came forth because of the properties that were preloaded into the creation as he spooled it out. So that means the computer guys they're nowhere, even though they've been working very hard on this since the early 50s. Have you thought about mitosis and meiosis, Chris?
That's yes, but I think your description of it is probably the best I've ever heard on that one. When I think of mitosis and meiosis, those processes to me are miraculous, and they're miraculous on multiple levels. One is when I see them under a microscope, and I recall encountering those for the first time in about ninth grade. We saw them, we stained the slides, we looked at onion roots, right, the fast growing cells of onion roots, and we had to find all four phases, right, and sketch them in our journals and whatnot. And I can remember even being captivated at that age by it. But then when I got into a little molecular biology and I understood the process by which what I was observing was happening, it occurred to me the incredible complexity I was actually witnessing, and all the complexity I simply couldn't because it was on a smaller scale. Like, tell us a little more about that, John. You know this one better than I.
Well, okay. So for those who are uninformed about these two processes, these are the processes of cell division by which a cell converts itself into either 2 or 4 new cells. So mitosis is the process of one cell dividing to make 2. So when your body is growing, that's what is happening. Cells are dividing so that you can have more cells, so that you can grow. Meiosis is a very similar process, but it results in 4 cells instead of 2. And unlike mitosis, in mitosis, each new cell has a complete copy of the 46 human genes, rather chromosomes, right? So you have 23 chromosomes from your mother and 23 chromosomes from your father. They're in matched pairs, okay? And we consider them numbered 1 through 23. The 23rd chromosome is the sex chromosome. So, you know, a Y chromosome can only come from a male because females don't have one. They have 2 X chromosomes. So if you get 2 X's, one from dad, one from mom, you're going to be a woman. And if you get a Y from your dad and a X from your mom, you're going to be a man. Well, anyway, well, I guess I kind of combined the 2 descriptions in the attempt to just give you the one. So what I was saying about mitosis is it's just cell division. And meiosis is not only cell division, but the chromosomes are separated. And so in the sex cells or germline cells, these are sperms and eggs, okay? Sperm and eggs for men and women. Though in those cells, after meiosis occurs, these cells only have 23 chromosomes. They don't have 46. Each of them has half of what a human needs. So when a fertilized egg is formed, then the sperm and the egg both brought with them a set of 23. And so now you have the zygote, which is a human that is 1 cell big, you know, at the moment of conception. That zygote now has 46 chromosomes. Now, these 2 processes happening is utterly beyond comprehension in its just its amazement is there's no end to being amazed at it and watching these cells do this. It's impossible to really look at it and not think that something is guiding this. You know, these chromosomes and the whole cell are engaged in this really complicated dance. And it's impossible really to think about this. The dance has so many components to it. And they're all just happening. They all just happen. And it's all coordinated and it all goes according to plan. And at the end of it, you have 2 cells or 4. And at the beginning, the nucleus, that's where the chromosomes are. In your cells, the chromosomes are inside the nucleus of the cell. So the first thing that has to happen is the nuclear envelope has to dissolve, has to come apart, set these chromosomes loose inside the cell. So that's the first thing that happens. As soon as that happens, these points in the cell start spewing out what they call microtubules. These are microscopically thin tubes of proteins that are being formed from the kinetochores of the chromosomes. So in a mitosis situation, the chromosomes actually were duplicated before we start, so that one chromosome, which looks like a worm, now has its brother attached to it, or sister attached in the middle, like this. So the kinetochore is the place where they are attached. And these microtubules just start spewing out from the kinetochore and heading out towards the opposite sides of the cell. And then these once all that is set up, this is happening for all the chromosomes. Once this is set up, then the chromosomes are dragged apart from each other. The two that are stuck together and all the other 22 pairs, they're dragged apart by proteins that are marching down the microtubule and pulling behind them the chromosome and pulling them apart. And so the two chromosomes, or 23 pairs, are all pulled apart. I skipped a step. Before that, they all line up down the middle of the cell, all right? Just fantastically, they know where to go. So all 23 pairs kind of line up down this plane, on this plane in the middle of the cell. Then they start spewing out the microtubules. Then the proteins start marching along, these motor proteins, and pull the chromosomes apart. And what happens is 23 chromosomes go this way, 23 go that way, one of each kind. And once they're far apart, then the cell automatically knows what to do, and it starts shrinking down in the middle and bifurcates, right? So now you've got two cells, and then each of them start, the chromosomes start shrinking down and getting back, and a new nuclear envelope forms around it. I've given you the merest outline of the process. So I started asking these biologists and stuff, this just seems miraculous. I mean, how can this be happening without a conductor, a few operations managers, logistical coordinators, people sending all the proteins in, people standing off to the side saying, attach over here, send that over here. I mean, if humans were building a ship or a building or something, that's what it would take. It would take all these intelligent beings all around, coordinating actions, guiding cranes, bringing in materials. And all this is just happening inside the cell. So I started asking, who's running the show? I mean, where's the intelligence driving this? Because it clearly is. And you get all these answers about chemical gradients and cell signaling molecules and everything. But the more you try to answer the question by bringing in these additional components that are involved in the operation, the more complex it just gets. And it just gets so complex, you can barely keep track of it all. And you still haven't got an answer, like, well, so how all of these things know what to do? Because they all know exactly what to do.
John, if I could chime in on that one of the kind of ideas that floated in my mind on that is like, you take your car to a mechanic and the car runs, and you ask the mechanic how to explain it, and instead they try to tell you how the wrench will turn this and a certain kind of pin will remove this over here, but they still don't get to the engineering of the car. A lot of the materialists or mechanist type can tell you more and more about the mechanisms, but they don't understand that's leading you further and further into the argument of, well, how do the mechanisms even get there in the first place? You have a law of physics that says things tend towards entropy and disorder. How in the world does this happen? And that's where I still, like you, in the conversations I have with this, I can get people telling me more mechanisms, but that doesn't explain how the mechanism even got there in the first place. That's a rough one.
I started noticing a few years ago the number of scientists who agree with this claim, that starts with Richard Feynman, all right, in the introduction to his book from the 1950s called QED. Science describes things. It doesn't explain them. You want an explanation for why it's like this? Science is not going to give that to you. It can tell you some descriptions, like a mechanic saying, well, if you turn this handle, this wrench, this bolt will come out. Okay, why? Well, if you keep going in far enough, you'll get to the point where you have to talk about the design of the car. You can't just talk about the, what a mechanic would know. Sooner or later, you have to get to the point where the mechanic can't answer the question because he's not an automotive engineer. Only the automotive engineer can answer the question of why this is arranged this way. So the mechanic can describe it. He can say the piston is 3 inches in diameter. But the automotive engineer is the one that can say, why is it 3 inches in diameter? And it's because it's needed this way to make this happen in this certain way. And that's the way we designed it, so the motor will run. Anyway,
this brings us back to a big question. Go ahead.
No, well, I've observed several different scientists in their writings have made the same observation that scientists describe things. They don't explain them very well.
And that's something that our students need to know, because oftentimes the rhetoric that they hear about what science is and what it can rule and cannot rule on is a little bit overblown in the media. And in fact, there's a Harvard historian of science, Stephen Chapin, whose books I read a number of years ago, not the least of which is Never Pure. This is a book about, essentially, he's a Harvard historian of science who wants to lower the tone about science as being the vaunted one epistemology or way of knowing that we should think about it. And this book has one of the best subtitles, I think, of all time. Let me read this one. Never Pure is the title. The subtitle is Historical Studies of Science as if it was produced by people with bodies situated in time, space, culture, and society, and struggling for credibility and authority. I thought it was a beautiful subtitle to put on a book like that. We have a number of people who study the mechanisms and study it very, very well. And we should, frankly. I mean, as Christians and as scientists, we should do this. We should look at those mechanisms as far as we can. But we have to remember the mechanism isn't everything. And that's one of those pieces that oftentimes I don't think our students hear as often. When I was teaching in brick and mortar school, I'd often ask the question the first couple of days of school, how many of you say that what's your knowledge of science? Like, give me a rating on 1 to 5. And some kids are like, oh yeah, 5. I know what I should know by now. Others are like, oh, 2. And I said, do you think of your knowledge of faith as sort of second rate to your knowledge of science? And they had to think about that for a minute. And many of them were like, well, yeah. And I said, well, why? And they said, well, because science does things like, this rock or this coffee cup or this whatever. It can tell us a lot about this. And I said, but that's the description of that is only one way of looking at that thing, right? We don't have a final cause, for example. You can bring Aristotle in there. They've just been studying this upstairs, and let's bring it down to the lab. And it started this beautiful conversation about epistemologies, the way that we know, what we can say we know, and how we can say we know it. It started a great set of conversations about facts and truth, which are contained in most of the Novare Science textbooks. They gave us some great foundations to talk about that. And how do we know? What is the actual method by which we can claim scientific knowledge or not? And our kids oftentimes just are not as strongly versed in that as they could be. And oftentimes just an exploration of that set of questions, that wheelhouse there can spark some good imagination and some good rethinking.
Yeah. Let's talk about another one of my favorites on the research side. A new book came out a few years ago by a biologist named J. Scott Turner, who I had the privilege of meeting just a couple of months ago. And when I met him, I was able to tell him that I really enjoyed reading his book and that I quote him all the time now. And I've even given presentations at conferences using some of his ideas. The book is called Purpose and Desire, and any biology teacher out there who hasn't read it needs to read it very soon. It helps to have had, a semester of biology to read it. You need to know when people you need to know what homeostasis is and the different some of the different things that biologists have to say about the control of equilibrium or dynamic disequilibrium in cells and in bodies. And because he's not writing to a lay audience that doesn't know a thing. So it'd be better if you've at least read a biology book, you could follow it better. But if you're a biology teacher, you know some biology, so you can read it easily. Turner makes this claim. He says that there is a mystery at the core of homeostasis we have not come close to addressing. Biology is in crisis, but doesn't want to admit it. Now, here's what it means. Homeostasis is a big word that means this. Your body has to keep the cells in your body, of which there are about 37 trillion, and your body as a whole, they must keep various parameters within bounds of what human physiology can tolerate. For example, your blood pH has to stay with between, what is it, 7.35 and 7.45, if I have that right. Or maybe it's 7.75 and 8.5. I forget whether it's acidic or basic, but you've got about 1 notch of pH, a window, with a medium, at the 0.5 in between. If your pH gets outside of that, your body can't take it. So your body has to control the pH. Now, your body also has to control the temperature and the salinity. This is all happening inside of every one of your cells, your 37 trillion cells, all at once. So pH and temperature and salinity, you've got all these nutrients that your cells need, and like sodium and potassium, lots of them. All those have to be controlled. They have to be, the cells have to open protein transporters to allow some of these to come in or go out to maintain the right concentration. This is happening in 37 trillion cells all at the same time. Now, it's also happening in the whole organism at the same time, your whole body. All right, so your whole body has to control its overall temperature, everything. So imagine if, all right, so there are about 1.5 billion cars in the world. Imagine all of them being controlled by some central processor, so that all the cars get gas at coordinated times. They all drive at certain speeds and times. They never crash into one another. They're all their actions are coordinated and controlled within the parameters that it takes to make this overall thing work. So your cells are basically doing this, except that in your body, there are 25,000 times as many cells as there are cars in the world. So 25,000 times harder of a problem to control. And yet every one of our bodies is doing this with ease, right? They all come from the womb, ready and designed to do this. Not just us, but every other organism in the world too is all doing this. So Turner's point is that this simply defies mechanical explanation. That's basically what his whole book is about. And he reviews the history of theory about life. In the 19th century, vitalism was a common position held by scientists, that there's a life force. And people who held that position were called vitalists. And their view is vitalism. There's some mysterious life force that keeps things alive so that they do this, so that they exhibit homeostasis and try to stay alive. The mechanical view that says that there is no life force, that organisms do this all by themselves, that view eventually won out. And so we get into the 20th century, and the scientists are going down the road of trying to do their research and find explanations for everything that do not depend on a vital force, that just depend on the laws of physics alone. And Turner shows that this search is it is pointless because there is no answer to that search. So that's what he means by his quote, by the quotation that I read, that they've painted themselves into a corner. Their research can't go any farther given their current set of presuppositions. But they won't. So he says biology's in crisis, but they don't want to admit it. Because to admit it would mean to say, we need to go in a different direction. Maybe we need to go back to vitalism and see what that would look like. Maybe there is a vital force. Of course there is. The vital force is whatever agency from God is acting in the life of a living thing to make it live, right? God is the source of all life, and he's the giver of life. And I love Psalm 104, which says that when an animal dies, God takes away its breath. God takes his breath away. That's what happens when something dies. God takes its breath away. It's not a machine that ran out of gas. It's an organism that had its breath of life removed by the life giver. That's what happens. Well, anyway, homeostasis is another, I gave the merest description of it, just a general kind of thing. But if you study all the things that are involved, it's just like mitosis and meiosis. It's just another exhaustively complex process.
You got me thinking about this one from two different. I'm of course taking notes while you're talking about this one with Turner. Turner's a book is on my bookshelf here, and seeing you mention in here is going to cause me to go pick that thing up after we're done here. That's going on the short list for reading. He mentions that piece about scientists essentially not wanting to pivot, right? They're holding on to a very materialist notion of this. But I think it's important, and it's important for our students to know too, that sometimes the best revisions of science happened when there was enough humility to set aside the old theory to the point that we can now come around to a whole different set of ideas. I'm thinking about caloric, for example, our old theory of heat that even seemed to hold up really well under a couple of interpretations, but then we noticed that certain things happen that just can't be it. That can't be the one. Drilling cannons and drill bits heating up and cooling off and how it goes. And then finally someone pitches a new idea and it's like, okay, now we're off onto something we can go. We have to remind our students that right there, that humility of approach is also some of the best science. It's what's put us at the doorstep of many of the best scientific discoveries in time too.
In his book, Turner, he mentioned several times. In fact, he describes this at the beginning, and then he alludes to it several times later. So you need to pay attention and get it down. So you're not like me later going, wait, what was that? Having to read chapter 1 again. But he talks about what he calls Hobson's choice. And for a professor, Hobson's choice works this way. If you want your papers published, they need to fall within the paradigms that everybody else is working in. If you start saying things that everybody else has decided we're not going to talk about, then you will be ostracized by the rest of the scientific community and you will not get your papers published. So here's Turner writing a book where he's going to say things that the rest of the scientific community rejects. And he's alerting you at the very beginning that what he's doing is making Hobson's choice on the side that's bad for his own career. I think he probably waited until, right at retirement age to publish that book just for this reason, because he's a great biologist. He probably has published many papers, but he probably wasn't going to get any more papers published after this book came out, where he's proposing that we need to go back to vitalism as a way of allowing biology to move forward. Anyway, good read for every biology teacher for sure. I didn't hear at the beginning when you guys were setting up the parameters for this meeting. How long are we going to go before we start looking at Q&A?
It's funny you said that because I just pulled up the one question we have so far on the guide. And I would love, if anybody has questions, go drop them in the chat right there. the book again. That one's to you, John. Purpose and
Oh,
Desire.
yeah,
J.
book
Scott
again.
Turner, I think.
Yeah, Purpose and Desire. J. Scott Turner.
There we go. We had an anonymous
okay, while we're
attendee.
waiting.
We had an anonymous attendee drop a question in the Q&A, and I think both of us could really do a good one on this one, John. Maybe we'll take a turn on it. Speaking of biology, pointing to a creator, do you agree with Nancy Percy that Christians should all be under one unifying banner against evolution, and the banner should be ID, intelligent design?
I don't see that question. I wonder why. I don't see it in my chat column.
Tell you what, I'll take that and I'll put it in the chat. I share that one over from the other. There we go.
Oh, there it is. No, yeah, okay. All right. Well, no, I would disagree with the proposition there that we should be under one unifying banner against evolution. I read a lot. I read a lot of top theologians and a lot of top scientists, and many of those scientists are Christians. And virtually all that I've read have said that it is scientifically certain that our bodies did evolve along with the rest of the creation. There are big uncertainties about how that occurred and all the mechanisms involved. It's certainly true that there's a lot more going on than simply mutations and natural selection. So there's and these other mechanisms are being discovered constantly as we speak. I mean, their horizontal gene transfer was unknown a few years ago. Hox genes were unknown a few years ago.
Epigenetics wasn't known a few years ago. The whole
branch. Right. So I remember when the first time one of my biology colleagues, this would have been about 15, maybe 20 years ago, one of my biology colleagues was astonished. He came in, he just read a paper. This is a common example now that comes up in this context, but this is the first time I'd heard about it. He just read this paper about these guppies. The guppies did not have, they did not know of this certain other species of fish as a predator. So if you put guppies in the tank with them, they just get eaten. Well, at one point, the biologists were training the guppies to regard the predator fish as such, to be afraid of it and try to get away from it. So, well, it turns out that when those guppies had baby guppies, those new fish were born already afraid of that predator. And now this was the first known instance of sort of what we call a Lamarckian inheritance. Lamarck was a scientist, way back around 1900, that had proposed that acquired traits could be inherited. So the goofy example that he used was, I think it's goofy, you'll see why, giraffes like to eat the leaves off of trees that are above their heads, so they're straining their necks to try to reach up there. You do this long enough, your neck will stretch out a little bit, and your offspring will be born with a little bit longer neck. And you do this through a few generations, and pretty soon you have a giraffe. Well, this is a goofy example. For one, a lot of animals eat leaves off trees, and they don't have long necks. Two, a lot of people have acquired traits that their kids did not inherit, right? Even traits they were born with that their kids didn't inherit. Einstein's children were not as smart as Einstein, that kind of thing. But bodybuilders and world-class sprinters and all that, they developed these characteristics by exertion, just the way the supposed giraffes got their long necks, but they didn't pass those traits on to their children, so their offspring. So science abandoned Lamarckian notions of inheriting acquired traits. And they said, okay, the only traits you can acquire or inherit are those that are in the genes, in the chromosomes. that was the reigning paradigm in physics, in biology, until just about 20 years ago, when the Guppy experiment occurred and everybody was blown away. How in the world could that happen? Well, just a few years after that, so this is all recent history, the whole field of epigenetics was born. Right around the same time, if you remember, if you were an adult paying attention 25 years ago, you were constantly hearing people use the phrase junk DNA, because our DNA, the chromosomes, the 23 chromosomes at 23 times 2, 46, these are extraordinarily long molecules, billions and billions of base pairs matched, conveying the genetic code. And yet, only a few percent of it is used for coding proteins, making proteins, which is what the code does. And so scientists are going, well, what's the deal with all this other 97% or whatever it is of the DNA? What's it used for? Can't figure out that it's used for anything. So it must be useless. So we'll call it junk DNA. Well, what's that, Chris?
No, I love that. If we can't figure out what it is, that's just junk. Oh, wait, hold your fire on that thought, right? Continue.
Well, right around this time, in the early 2000s, is when we start discovering that, well, wait a minute. There are all kinds of things going on in this other part of the DNA, and it all has to do with switching and controlling which genes get switched on and which get switched off. And there's all these blocker proteins and signaling proteins. It's just another big complicated scenario in biology. But there's a lot going on in the DNA that's not just the little stretches of DNA that are used to manufacture a protein, or one of the tens of thousands of proteins that we use, that we have. So there's all kinds of other things going on to control which genes can get switched on and which can get switched off. So you have lots of capabilities in you that are either being expressed, that means they're alive, you can see them, or they're not expressed, but they're in there. So think about this, all right? Think about this. This just occurred to me, but I was preparing for this by watching some stuff yesterday, but this connection just occurred to me. You guys all need to know about Stephen Wiltshire. His surname is spelled Wiltshire. Stephen Wiltshire. The YouTube video that I like the best, it's 44 minutes long, and he's called Stephen Wiltshire, the Human Camera. But there are any number of other videos. There are some that are only a couple of minutes long because they occurred on the evening news. And then there are others that are really, long, hour-long pieces. Well, now, here's what Stephen Wiltshire can do. All right, so he was born severely autistic. He didn't say a word until he was about 5 years old. Everybody thought he was mute. And then he started realizing he had a creative gift in art. So he starts drawing things. And about that same time, he starts developing the ability to speak. When his art is going, he can start speaking. Well, then he grew to be an adult, and then he did this astonishing thing. He's now done it many times, but it started in London. They put him on a helicopter. The helicopter did a 20-minute tour over London, and then they had set up like a marker board about the size, height-wise, of a wall marker board in a classroom, but about twice as long as a conventional marker board, so maybe 20 feet long. And the whole thing is not a marker board; it's paper, and it's on a frame, and it's in a curve like this. Well, he had a 20-minute ride over London in a helicopter, looking out the window, and then they plopped him in front of this, and gave him 100 marker pens, and he stood there for 5 days and drew the city of London from memory. Every building, every street, the right number of windows in every building that he drew, and the right shape of every building, the right orientation of all the streets. The drawing itself is an utter masterpiece, and would have been, even if he had taken a year to do it, and he had walked the streets to get everything straight to come back and draw it. But he did it in a week based on a 20-minute observation ride over the city. Now, he's just as human as you and I are. So where does this come from, this savant behavior like this? Well, it just occurred to me while we were talking about epigenetics that the same capability is probably in every human, and it's not expressed. The gene is not expressed. It's not switched on in most of us. And to switch it on for some reason activates other genes that are connected to this sort of autistic behavior, the language difficulties and things like that. Well, I think there's a lot of mystery, but I'm way off track. We were started with evolution, I know, but so let me get back to that now that I've mentioned Stephen Wiltshire. I think my position that I'm not afraid to say anymore. I used to hedge my bets for a long, long time, but the position among scholarly theologians and scientists who are Christians is that evolutionary processes did occur. The first Christian scientist ever to write a book on this, as probably most people know, is Francis Collins, called The Language of God. He's a card-carrying Baptist deacon. And until just recently, he was the head of the National Institutes of Health. And so he also discovered the cystic fibrosis gene. He knows as much about genetics as any other person. And he wrote this book to evangelicals in the church to say, folks, I'm a geneticist and I know genes. And let's look at this. If we look at genes, the conclusion is inescapable that we did evolve. Now, two things to say about this. One, if it happened, it didn't happen by itself, right? So it's just the way God brought it forth. That's all. A lot of the groups that talk about this, they constantly confuse atheism and evolution. Like they can't talk about evolution without talking about atheism. But these are separate issues. There's nobody who believes in evolution who's a Christian who's an atheist, right? Evolution is not an atheist position. Years ago, the National Association of one of the science organizations, one of the national ones for education, had a definition for evolution up there that said that it occurred by random processes, strictly random processes. And they eventually revised their statement. They took that out because they realized they were confusing evolution per se with an atheistic view of the world where nothing happens except random processes. There's no intentionality, no purpose and desire bringing creatures along. So the view of these faithful Christians, these scholars, Christian, scientific and theological, their view is that evolution happened and that God superintended it the whole way, and that what we know of it is simply the tip of the iceberg, that there were lots of things going on. And I mean, we could spend the rest of the time, that is all just about up. We could spend the rest of the time and more just going down that list. So that would be my answer to your question. No, I would not agree and say we all just ought to align. I would say we should continue having a dialogue and a conversation. We should read widely on these questions so that we can study to show ourselves approved, as Peter says.
Yeah, in short, I would second what John says. I tend to think the same thing right there, but I wanted to pivot to a question that popped up here. Joylyn Blake, good to see you here. You mentioned, do you have any recommendations for easy access points in conversation with young people to bring the reigning epistemology into question? Understanding the modern or postmodern disposition to give preeminence to mechanistic scientific thinking. How can we simply and lovingly point out its inadequacies? Let me take a moment to address that one, because I think that's a really important piece for science instruction. We can talk about this at a big level, but we are ultimately, at the end of the day, emotions of biology to children. And so that leads to a good question. I've got a couple, and here are a couple. And John, I know you've got plenty. You've been in the classroom for years and years too. You know these. I think one of the easiest ones for me is to get the kids thinking about the first lesson of the school year is a still life. We come in and we sit around a still life that I've set up in the middle of the table. And I have all the students sketch the still life from where they're sitting around the outside. And of course, I've set the still life up so there's a big glass mason jar in the middle and a whole bunch of other little things around the outside, bones and rocks and a pine cone and a couple other things. And I've set it up so that from any given point around the room, you're going to have a particular vantage on this. And about 2 minutes before I close everything down, I'll walk around and ask the kids to number their paper. I'll walk in a circle around the table, number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, all the way around. And then we take those pieces of paper and put them side by side and let them walk the gallery. They see that what person number 1 saw is not the same as what person 5 saw, because these are 5 seats away from one another. Their perspective on the thing is different. And there are objects that are hidden within that still life so that a person sitting at position 5 can't see it. Maybe it's a snail shell on the far side of that big glass mason jar, but person number 13 on the other side of the table, they can see it. And I say, science is a lot like this, kids. Some things we see very clearly. The things closest to us, well illuminated right before our eyes, we see that clearly. Some things, like you see through the glass, are bent and distorted a little. Our perception isn't there. Whether it's our reasoning, our lack of data, something is distorting our ability to reason what that thing is and reckon what it is on the far side of the jar. And some things, by virtue of where you are right now and your limitations of view, you can't see at all. And so our very first lesson of the year is a perspective check. And I said that right there is in part science and in part theology. We have to have a humility about both in order to understand how all these pieces can fit together. But we also have to wonder, what's on the other side of the jar? We know there are things we can't see. Do we hunger to find those in the proper way? And it leads to some fantastic discussions. A simple question that I've used in the past to help kind of tease this out a bit is prove to me empirically that your mother loves you. Can you quantify love? Is there a way to do? You can do it anecdotally and others, but it leads to a discussion about things we can measure and things we can't. Things we can perceive that are real and true and good, but that we can't necessarily quantify in the way that we might in a science lab. To do this with teachers, I often put up a picture of a science lab, a well-maintained, clean, white, pristine science lab, and a garden over here on this side, which is, of course, messy and full of clippings and all kinds of other pieces. And I asked the teachers, to what in you, as a learner as well as a teacher, do these beckon? One has all the empiricism in those pieces in an isolation, and the other has everything in context. The garden is nothing but contextual biology. And so oftentimes for children, just to encounter images that make certain principles or discussions emerge or come clear or even remain unclear deliberately, that can get to. One thing I love about John's textbooks, and I'll volley this back over, is that they all start with a provocative picture. Every chapter in those books starts with a provocative picture. And it gives you a chance to talk through some of these things off the bat. The biology textbook I've just seen, but some of my favorites that I teach from, earth science textbook, physical science, all of those have some image at the beginning that you can behold before you start discussing and pulling apart. So John, what would you answer to that question? Easy access points for conversation for students.
Well, of course, that's the purpose for this webinar, is to provide one of those, right? Just to kind of hit on some of the issues that can easily be pointed to, like homeostasis. So if you want to read all about the trouble with that, you can read Scott Turner's book. Genetics is another one. if you want to read something about that, you can read Francis Collins' book, which is, it's 20, 30 years old now. But that was still an important early contribution. So there are lots of an increasing number of books. And Adam and the Genome is another one that came out a few years ago by a pair of authors. One is a biologist and one is a theologian. So the biologist takes the theology side. The biologist takes the scientific side and takes half the book to summarize the scientific evidence that we have today for evolution having occurred. And the theologian, whose name I forget, the scientist was Scott McKnight, I think, and the theologian, maybe think of it in a second. Anyway, he takes the theological side and says, all right, let's go to the book of Genesis. Let's see if we can reapproach the scriptures by asking new questions. I'm looking at this question that just popped up. Can you give the name of the biology book you were referring to with pictures? Is she referring to something you said, Chris?
Yes, I was referring to Novare's textbooks, all having a provocative picture at the start of each chapter.
Yeah. So he's talking about our texts, Novare Science. Oh, the general biology. Okay.
Yep.
Paul says. Now, I just noticed, I want to go back up to the thing about uniting under one banner, because I was glancing at that question again. And I think my answer was a little off from what that question actually posed. The question was, should we unite under one banner, and the banner should be intelligent design? Here, maybe, but here's my reservation. I mentioned a moment ago that it's common for advocates of intelligent design to mix up atheism and evolution. And this is common in the intelligent design circles. I've read any number of books, and what invariably happens, and this is very frustrating to me, but what invariably happens is you got a book that says something like, the scientists who disagree, and here they're all going to write their essays, and you get started reading on one, evolution, it's a lie, and here's why. And then, like, by the second paragraph, we're talking about atheism. And I've seen this happen so many times that I realized there seems to be some disconnect here. Now, I saw some of this is old knowledge, so my brain's getting old, and I gotta stop and think about it. Who wrote Intelligent Design? What's his name? William Dembski. William Dembski. All right, so William Dembski wrote Intelligent Design. He's the one that floated that concept. And Michael Behe was another early contributor with his book, Darwin's Black Box. I saw William Dembski speak at a university in Houston, I think it was, and he gave a presentation, and the room was basically full of, there was a handful of people like me who were believers, who were wanting to learn more about what he was saying, and there was a lot of people in the room who were unbelievers. And so when he finished his talk, the unbelievers went on the attack and tried to burn Dembski to the ground. And I thought he did a super job of holding his own. But the thing was that William Dembski was not proposing a theory to replace evolution. He was just saying evolution can't happen without intelligence to drive it forward. That intelligent information encoded in genes can't come from unintelligent sources. If you track it back far enough, there has to be an intelligent origin. And he was castigated for not coming up with an alternative scientific theory. But he said, that's not my job. My job is just to point out that what we're working with here is scientifically impossible. You can't get intelligence from things that are not intelligent somehow. There has to be, like those computer models, there has to be coding somewhere that's telling systems what to do and how to do it so that they obey certain rules. The rules themselves coded into the environment of the system. So my hesitation is just because of the ID community so frequently attaching themselves to saying evolution is an atheistic theory, therefore, we have to stand against it. And I just think that's mixing up two very different concepts, right? Atheism, obviously, every Christian stands against that because we believe in not only God, but a personal God, loving God, redeeming, saving God. But scientifically, as we look at the world that he made, and he gave us minds that want to inquire into it and test things and try out ideas, he created us to do that. He gave us the kind of minds who can do that. And as we do, we come across all this evidence that species have a history and they're related to one another genetically. Well, what do you do with that? Well, you start thinking scientifically, how could this have happened? So what I say today is, if evolution happened, it didn't happen by itself. And second, not only did it not happen by itself, but the mechanisms involved are far more numerous than we know about at present. Here's one that I don't hear quoted very often, but it's very interesting to me. This comes from Alvin Plantinga, who's a philosopher at Notre Dame. I think this is in his book, Where the Conflict Really Lies, but I couldn't find it in my notes last time I looked, so I'm not sure if that's the source. But he said, God could cause mutations in organisms that don't give an advantage immediately. So that they, the typical natural selection thing is that the organism has an advantage because of a mutation. And that advantage allows the organism to multiply more successfully. And so the population who has this mutation eventually dominate. And you do this over and over, and you go from little simple organisms to big complicated organisms. But Plantinga points out that there's no reason why the creator, who has infinite knowledge and infinite power, he couldn't cause mutations that convey no advantage to propagate in the species, in the population, and accumulate in the genes until they collectively provide some whopping new glorious feature. And then he causes them to be so expressed, and suddenly you've got a whole new organism that completely looks differently with new capabilities like flight or whatever. When I read that, I thought, oh, that makes total sense. And it could explain the complete eruption of mammals after the extinction event that took out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. As soon as that happened, as soon as the dinosaurs were gone, the mammals just exploded. And it wasn't, I can't believe it was just because they had the space to explode into. Something had to drive the genetic transitions to bring them all about. And it seems to me like a great application for Plantinga's idea. Well, I think there are probably hundreds of things going on that we don't know about yet, that are involved in the development of new species from previous species. We know a handful, and I think there are probably many, many more. Plantinga's idea might be one of them.
We are vastly limited in our embodied natures, and that is one thing that I think should give us a lot of humility. we can only reason. So, as J.B.S. Haldane, the famous astrophysicist, said, the universe is not only stranger than we suppose, but stranger than we can suppose. There are whole categories of things we can't observe or know. And there goes my cattle dog, by the way. Someone asked about that. I wanted to riff back to the questions here as we're pushing the 2:12 marker. I know a number of folks will probably end up bowing out on this one, but I saw a couple of questions come along about how to explain this to kids. Joylyn, you led with that one. We have one in here, a great comment by Shelley Lamp, who says, I think we do a disservice to our students. We tell them most scholarly, well-read scientists believe we evolved. There's also many well-read scholars and theologians who do not think it's a proper conclusion. There were a couple of other folks who were chiming in about this whole knowledge piece. And I want to make sure it's emphasized here at this juncture. Two things are occurring. And you might have heard the conversation pivoted a little bit to the notions of logic. We're talking a lot about how we reason. How do we figure things out? There's induction, of course, in science. There's deduction. But there's also fallacies of logic. There are a number of things, and humans use that logic to communicate our ideas to buy fans, right? And favorites here, as we're talking about too, as we're talking about rhetoric, as it enters into that. How do we persuade people to certain ideas? And I think one of the best ways to get people to understand some of this kind of meta study of science, what is science really, and how are we applying it, and how are we misapplying it, perhaps, is to look into the logic. It's to look into the way that we're speaking about this. It's to look at the words we're using. There was a conflation of atheism and mechanistic evolution that we were just talking about a moment ago that could be very easily cleared up by simply introducing the students to the split between those two terms. People use them like it's the same thing, and they're intimately related, but they are not. And to show that allows kids to have a certain set of corrective earpieces, so that when they hear someone speaking that way, they can go, oh, okay, I see that. I've seen that before. That looks like this. Is it truly? And they can ask a question or two to draw that out. Another one that kind of strikes me with this, and I made a note of it a while ago, I'll double back to it, is Owen Barfield. Let's actually go to the humanities here. And Robbie Andreessen, I saw your post about that humanities science connection with SCL. Absolutely, brother. That is a way to go. Owen Barfield, one of the Inklings, famously said in his book, Saving the Appearances, to explain should not be to explain away. And I think that's another really important thing that we need to put in front of our students here at this juncture of history and our cultural moment, if you will, over science, because we can explain it, but there's such incredible complexity that we're talking about here. We cannot explain it away and say it's just this, right? It's just mere matter. Paraphrase C.S. Lewis, you've never met a mere mortal. I don't think you've ever really met mere matter either. There's something to this at some levels of God's design that is really powerful, and we only know it but so far. And maybe that's all we can know it right now. But that should lead us then to be kind of humble, to see the explanation, to wonder, but then wonder in the wonder. There are things about this we don't know. And if we're raising our science students to think of our science education as just facts and figures and lab procedures, which they should be able to do and do very well, mastery of those principles is the way. But if we also show them there's so much we don't know, and the question marks are so grand, hey, guess what? That's your inheritance. You take this on now. I'll give you the puzzles as we see them. You learn this so well enough that you then get in there and try it yourself. Try your own mind at it. Talk to others who are there. Then we get something really powerful here. And I think that will open up a number of the debate pieces that we've got right here, from what is the role of science in our moment to how does theology and science argue about this or come to concurrent conclusions? What do we do? So that element of logic and rhetoric enters in well. That notion of humility enters in well, saving the appearances just because we can explain it, explains it away. That's an important thing for our students to savor, perhaps. And there were 6 new messages while I was just talking there. So let me scroll down.
Yeah. I gave a talk last week and quoted Lewis, as you just did, Chris, in The Weight of Glory, where he says, "You've never met a mere mortal." I've moved beyond that as well. And I said, you've never met a mere anything. There's nothing mere. I mean, every atom, everything is way vastly more complicated than we know. We think atoms are made of quarks, or rather, protons are made of quarks, and neutrons. But what are those? What are those? We have no idea. We have no idea what electrons are even. I enjoyed quoting Morris Klein, a great mathematician, who said that we have no physical understanding at all of what electromagnetic waves are, right? So, okay, we know that we can use them to send messages, and we know that light can be described that way and all, but what they are, it's one of those description, not explaining problems. We can describe them. We don't have any physical understanding of what they are. Feynman says something similar when he said, I can describe it for you, but you won't understand it because nobody does.
One of my sons came into my den here the other night. You can't see it right now, but my ham radio equipment's right here. I'm an amateur class license holder, which is the highest class of amateur extra amateur license. And he goes, Dad, how does this work? And I said, we don't really know. Here I am holding a license, and I've got the equipment right there. I can tune an antenna. I can do it empirically and get a good signal strength and rate resonance and others. But there's this whole mystery that comes right with it. And I think, to give that to our students is doing something, giving them a gift that just the facts alone most certainly could not. There's no way that alone can do it. And that kind of imagination is one that's really important. It's not just a framework for thinking logically, it's a whole imaginary. Robbie Andreessen, you got a lot of good contacts coming out of here, and I'm grateful for that. I know you've got something good cooking up down there.
Well, I think I want to mention a big one in the world of biology that we haven't even touched on yet, but that I've been giving presentations on now for a couple of years, and that's consciousness. The fact that we are conscious beings goes right along with intentionality, is something that's utterly without explanation in a material context. One of the things I gave a talk on this, I think it was last year at SCL, but or maybe it was at some other conferences, but originally I was calling it What Consciousness is Telling Us About the World. And what I started noticing was there are a lot of atheists and agnostics and Christians who are all saying the same thing. And when that happens, I start paying attention. I already quoted Thomas Nagel earlier when we were talking about intentionality. Well, consciousness is another one that he treats in that same book, Mind and Cosmos. But he's just one of several now. Paul Davies is a quite famous physicist who's an agnostic, who says that consciousness cannot be explained from a material world. It has to have existed before the material world existed. And so it's not an emergent property of evolution. It is a thing that was here before anything else. A scientist that I guess I can call him a scientist, who before I just found out about a couple of years ago. He's a cognitive scientist, I guess is the term he uses to describe himself. His name is Donald Hoffman. He has a book or two, but they're very scholarly in the cognitive science realm, which means they're probably impossible to read by ordinary people like me. But he has a lot of videos on YouTube that he does a lot of interviews with people. And here's a couple of things he says. He says, I do take consciousness as being the fundamental reality. Here's another one. Consciousness didn't emerge from a prior physical process of evolution. It's consciousness that's fundamental, not the physical universe. So it's comments like this that are you're starting to see pop up more frequently. I made a list of several people that I talked about in that presentation. Another one that you already mentioned, Chris, is Anthony Flew, who wrote the book, Why There Is a God. The title on the dust jacket says Why There Is Not a God, but the word not is crossed out in a big red X. He debated Christians for 50 years as an atheist professor of religion. And at the end of his life, he said, I have to follow the evidence where it leads. And all this evidence was basically scientific and biological evidence, not just consciousness, but other things too. And one of the last things he did in his life was become friends with N.T. Wright, who had the privilege of telling him about the Lord. So, it's fascinating to me that atheists are saying the same thing, that consciousness has to have an explanation that transcends the material realm. But some of us know where to put that transcendence in the living God, and some don't. I want to put it in some property that's out there that we haven't discovered yet, that's impersonal. They like it to be impersonal. They just don't know what to call it. But I think it's the same living God that is the one managing homeostasis and drawing the evolutionary development of creatures along, and furnishing the laws of physics and chemistry for the world so that it will behave the way he wants it to behave. The whole world is in his hands, as the old song says. And all these questions that the scientists can't answer are in his hands as well. Another thing that I haven't mentioned is the many authors I've seen now referring to the structure of the cosmos as being essentially, they use three words. They're all related. Mathematical, right? Galileo said that. Logical, and rhetorical. David Bentley Hart says the structure of reality itself is rhetorical. And James Jeans said something similar. So if you look at the structure of reality deeply, you find that it has a logical, intelligent structure, a structure that's like language, structure that's like mathematics, which is a language. So these are fascinating things to think. And you got people like James Jeans, who, as far as I know, I don't know anything about his religious affiliation, whether he had one. Just an astronomer for everything I knew. Frederick Hoyle said something similar too. He said it looks like the universe looks like a put-up job. His famous line. He's the one that discovered the carbon resonance in the sun that could allow the nuclear processes in the sun to produce heavier elements, starting with carbon. And he also was famously not a believer, but he made the same famous comment that the universe looks like a put-up job. It looks like someone's been monkeying with the works. So everywhere you look, you see even scientists who are saying that you bump your head up against a mystery at some point, and materialism doesn't get you any past it. But the creator that we worship does. This is the message that I think our teenagers need to hear. And if we just have a few examples to kind of get them rolling, get them excited, getting them enthusiastic, to break out of the lethargy of feeling like you're stuck in a place where everything you've been taught must be wrong or something like that. They need this sort of despair. They need a way to break out. Well, that's why we're doing this today. It's because this subject is a place where you can break out and discover that, whoa, there's so much more to say. And maybe even become a researcher and for yourself play a role in saying, like Scott Turner writing a book about purpose and desire being ubiquitous in biological systems. And that begs a question: where does that come from?
There's another question that I think we ought to float right here in our last couple of minutes. I think I was just given we've got less than 5 minutes to kind of wrap this up as we're staring down 2:30 here. And thank you everybody who's been with us for this whole ride. I mean, we have almost 60 people who are here and thinking about this and throwing some great questions back and forth. I want to leave you perhaps with this. And we are Magisters, right? We are the master learners in a classroom, not just a master of a body of knowledge or content, although we should be, but a master of a process, the process of learning. It's often said in classical education, the teacher is the curriculum, right? The magister is the curriculum. They're the sensei, the one who has walked before, to use a very Japanese term that really has a lot of application here. So as we then approach our youngsters and our teenagers and our older students, let's not forget that education doesn't end at 18. We can have these conversations at any age. Let's remember to become students of this thought line ourselves. Read the good books, have the great discussions, ask the hard questions, put those things out there to those that might be able to give you an answer or two or an in or two, but pose them to your friends amongst your faculty groups, amongst your homeschool parent groups, amongst your friends who might be university professors or others. Don't be afraid to engage the atheist with these. John and I do it frequently. We do it on the stage from time to time, which is a lot less fun than sometimes doing it over a brew. Right? Go and grab a meal with someone, break bread. And in the process of sharing food, share ideas, as we ourselves, as the magisters of this, learn how to best see, imagine, and then articulate what we have, the better we're going to be able to bring this to our students. So just continue the conversations, continue talking about this, continue throwing ideas around, reach out about it, not just to your small circle, but your increasingly larger ones. And the more we walk into this, the more we're going to see that some of the skills, of course, this is almost a quadrivial art, right? So it's a mathematical art, science in many ways, arithmetic and geometry, music, astronomy. We think of that. But remember the beauty of our language here. Our logic and our rhetoric are going to be extremely important as we continue to study these. The link in with the humanities and the traditional liberal arts, even though the sciences, as we practice them today, were not practiced this way in, say, the Middle Ages, the time when rhetoric and logic were really being honed. It was natural philosophy then. There are ways to bring the best of those things forward. And I think that's what we're actually doing right here, because natural philosophy is looking for wisdom in the natural world, loving the wisdom that's there, philosophia, not just looking for knowledge and power. Right? As Bacon wrote that in the Novum Organum in 1620, knowledge and power, yeah, they're in as one, but there are other things to be looking for here. And teaching our students to look for those as well as a 5 on the APs or the ability to become a good engineer is pretty important.
Well, we are out of time. Here's the last thing I'll say. I have an atheist friend that I've known 25 years. We've talked about things like this forever. 20 years ago, I asked him, why can mathematics be used to model the world? Why does that work so well? He had a great answer for it. He thought that he rolled out. Well, last year, I asked him the question again. And he looked at me and he said, I don't know. He's one of the smartest people. He's the smartest guy I know. He's the leading scientist in his field.
It's a legitimate answer, isn't it? I don't know.
He's a leading scientist in his field. He says, I don't know. And I say, well, I have an answer for it. My creation story has an intelligence behind it. So that's the thing I like students to know about. I think we are out of time. And
we had a great question pop up there. We are hitting time. I'll be glad to take that one via email. John, it's a pleasure to sit here with you and to converse and to not only just sit at your feet, but also just go back and forth. And folks who are here, I feel honored. I'm honored that you were here to ask the good questions and to continue those. We have some we'll reach out to after all this. And very, very grateful for your time on this summer afternoon. I hope everybody stays cool out there. Stay cool, stay well, and keep praying about this. This is a much for our moment.
Megan sobbing, I see your question. Sorry we didn't get to it, but I'm sure if you'll email either one of us, we'll try to reply. Or maybe both.
Or both.
Right. All right, we'll wrap it up and say God bless you.
God bless everybody.
May you grow in the wisdom of Jesus Christ and in his love.
Amen.